God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him any way they want, as everybody else around them does. No, I'm sorry, I misread that. This is John 4, verse 24. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. We don't get to determine how to worship God. In Leviticus 23, we read about the Lord's feasts. Leviticus 23, start in verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, concerning the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. They're not the feasts of the Jews. Even though it says in Romans 2, verse 29, that we're supposed to be spiritual Jews, people might want to consider that next time they say, well, those are for the Jews. It says in Romans 2, verse 29, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. We are supposed to be spiritual Jews. We are supposed to be spiritual children of Abraham. But it says in Leviticus 23, even these are my feasts. Then it says in verse 4, these are the feasts of the Lord. So in verse 3, it talks about the Lord's Sabbath. And then in verse 4, it talks about the feasts of the Lord. Do you see people in society around us keeping the feasts of the Lord? Deuteronomy 12, start in verse 29. When the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whither thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them and dwellest in their land, take heed to thyself, that thou be not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God, for every abomination to the Lord, which he hateth, have they done unto their gods. For even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. You shall not add thereto, nor diminish from it. That's Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 through 32. And I suspect those are verses that you don't hear that much, especially around this time of year, if you know what I mean. Do not be snared, and take heed to yourself that you be not snared by following them, the nations from before thee. In other words, he was telling them, don't follow the religious practices of the nations that I will cut off when you go to possess them and dwell in their land. Don't follow what other people are doing with respect to religion. Whatever I command you, observe to do it. You shall not add thereto, nor diminish from it. Do you think most of the people in our society are following what God commands, are following the Lord's feasts? Incidentally, people like to say that the Sabbath and the feasts of the Lord are Jewish. They're not. I read to you in Leviticus 23, they are the Lord's feasts. There are some feasts that are Jewish feasts. I'll get to them in a moment. But it says, for example, in Ezekiel 22, verse 8, thou hast despised mine holy things and hast profaned my Sabbaths. Continuing in Ezekiel 22, verse 26. Here's an interesting verse. Her priests have violated my law and have profaned mine holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and profane, neither have they shown difference between the unclean and the clean, and have hid their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them. They are God's Sabbaths. Leviticus 23 refers to his holy days. Do we follow the nations around us? Do we follow the professing Christians around us? I'm not going to read this whole passage. I'd like you to finish reading it yourself. It means more when you read it. You've heard me say it. Jeremiah 10, Hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, this is Jeremiah 10, verse 2, learn not the way of the heathen. Do not learn the practices of the Gentiles. And whether you think the people living in our country around us, whether you think they're physical Gentiles or not, clearly most of the people living in this country are not spiritual children of Israel. They are spiritual Gentiles, and yet we're going to follow their practices? Someone who is inwardly Jewish, who has been circumcised in the heart, should be following what God commands. So as I said, learn not the way of the heathen, the Lord says in Jeremiah verse 2. Go ahead and read that verse and the next 3 verses on your own time. Pause the video now and go read Jeremiah 10, verses 2 through 5. I'll wait. You're back. Interesting, don't you think? Some people claim that God's holy days are Jewish. No, let me tell you a Jewish day. Incidentally, these 2 Jewish feasts, there's nothing wrong with them. For example, Esther chapter 9. Mordecai was a righteous man. There's nothing wrong with what he is telling the Jews to do. But this is a feast. It's a Jewish feast. It's not one of the feasts of the Lord. Read all of Esther, of course. Esther 9, verse 20. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15 days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. So we read there of Purim. That is a feast for Jews. It wasn't commanded by the Lord. It's not one of the feasts of the Lord. But there's nothing wrong with it. They're celebrating a deliverance that was occasioned by a very righteous man, Mordecai, and Esther. And I'm sure the Lord had something to do with it as well. But be that as it may, that's not one of the feasts of the Lord. It's a celebration of the Jews, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, had plotted to annihilate them. But instead, Haman and all the other enemies of the Jews, they were the ones who were annihilated at that time. Not the Jews. That was a big victory for the Jews. That's where Purim comes from, but that's not a feast of the Lord. There's nothing wrong with it, of course. It didn't come from paganism. It came from Mordecai. Read again. Go read Esther 9, verse 20. He established it. The Jews were celebrating on the, you can read the whole chapter. Anyway, that's a feast of the Jews. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not one of the feasts of the Lord. The feasts described in Leviticus 23 are all the feasts of the Lord. It's not the same. That's a Jewish celebration of a victory holiday in Esther 9. John 10, verse 22. I'm reading the New Living Translation here. And it was now winter, and Jesus was in Jerusalem at the time of Hanukkah, the festival of dedication. So we read in John 10, verse 22 of Hanukkah. Once again, nothing wrong with it, although that doesn't mean that it should become a sort of a Jewish substitute for Christmas either, which does have heathen origins. But there's nothing wrong with, and I'm not going to go into the history of Hanukkah, but it is certainly a Jewish feast. It's not commanded in Leviticus as one of the feasts of the Lord, but there's nothing wrong with Jewish people celebrating it. It didn't originate from heathenism. So yes, Purim and Hanukkah, you could say, are feasts of the Jews, but not the Sabbath. Indeed, if you read Isaiah 56, verse 6, also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, everyone that keeps the Sabbath from polluting it and takes hold of my covenant, Even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Read Isaiah 56, verses 1 through 7. You could read about strangers that will be keeping God's Sabbath. It is not just for Jews, it's for the sons of the stranger, according to Isaiah 56. Now, some will read this verse and get confused. If you go to, I think it's John 7, and they think, therefore, that the Feast of Tabernacles is a feast of the Jews. John 7. If I could find it, I thought I bookmarked it. John 7, verse 2. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. That's not saying there that is just a feast for the Jews only. It was commanded in Leviticus 23. And it's described as one of the feasts of the Lord. You should look at verse 2 of chapter 7 of John. Look at it more this way. It's describing a feast that was primarily being kept by Jews. But it's not just for Jews. I could prove that to you. Go to Zechariah 14. Now this is describing a future time that hasn't happened yet. Clearly you'll see that. Zechariah 14, verse 16 through 19. And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feasts of tabernacles. And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt go not up, and come not, that have no rain, there shall be the plague, wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. That's a future time, Zechariah 14, verses 16 through 19. It even says in verse 18, the plague wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen, not the Jewish people, that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, once again, it's always disgusting to hear people say, that holy day, that Sabbath is just for the Jews, as if that's a bad thing. The Word made flesh. When the Word was made flesh, he was made flesh as a Jewish man. I've always said anti-Semitism is a hatred of God, because when the Word was made flesh, he was made flesh as a Jewish man. In like manner, racism is a hatred of God, because all races were made in God's image. It doesn't say some. All are in God's image. None are inherently bad. None were an accident. All the races were made in God's image. So anti-Semitism and racism in reality is a animus towards the eternal. So I've shown we're not supposed to follow heathen practices. Is there a heathen practice coming later this year? I'll just say this. I try not to harp on it too much, but I'm going to say it anyway. You have the shortest day of the year coming up. After the solstice, the days start to slowly get longer. The sun shines a little longer. The heathen would celebrate the rebirth of the sun. Ever ask yourself why Christmas was illegal in Puritan New England? Until, I think, in some parts, it wasn't until the mid-19th century that they started celebrating it. They knew their Bible better than we do today. They knew it originated in heathenism. Go over the verses I read again. Should we follow heathen practices, or should we worship God in spirit and in truth? The festivals we read in Leviticus 23, God's seventh-day Sabbath, the days of unleavened bread, Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Tabernacles. Those feasts are the feasts of the Lord. Purim and Hanukkah can be called Jewish feasts, Jewish festivals, celebrating good things. There's nothing wrong with them. They don't come from heathenism. We see them referenced in John 10, verse 22. And if you read Esther chapter 9, you could see Mordecai writing in verse 20. He wrote these things and sent letters to establish among the Jews, verse 21, that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. Not a command of the Lord, but a celebration for the Jews. Those are feasts of the Jews. But God's seventh-day Sabbath and the feasts of the Lord in Leviticus 23 are not the same thing. And when people just say, well, those holy days are just for Jews. One, they don't realize we are supposed to be Jewish inwardly, Romans 2, verse 29. They've never read Isaiah 56, verses 1 through 7, that refers to the sons of the stranger being blessed for keeping the Lord's Sabbath. Zechariah 14, verses 16 through 19 shows that Tabernacles is not just a Jewish feast. The heathen that don't keep it will be plagued one day in the future. And it says, learn not the way of the heathen in Jeremiah 10, verse 2. Read the next few chapters and see what it says about decking a tree with silver and gold. And ask yourself, is it being said in a positive light? And ask yourself, doesn't it seem to make sense that the practice described in Jeremiah 10 and the practice many people will partake of later this month clearly have a similar origin? Does Deuteronomy 12 verses 29 through 32 say it's okay to use pagan customs to worship God? Read this book for yourself, and I need to read it for myself. Peace all. Bye-bye.